It was a long stretch of highway, one of those isolated, two-lane roads that cut through miles of nothingness. I was driving back from a work trip, and it was well past midnight. The sky was pitch black, with no moon, just a few faint stars visible through the clouds. My car's headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but beyond that, everything was swallowed by shadows. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt. I was in the middle of nowhere, no towns, no houses, just endless stretches of road with fields and forests on either side. My GPS said I still had about 2 hours to go before reaching the next town, and I was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in. The coffee I'd stopped for earlier was wearing off, and I was beginning to regret not pulling over for a quick nap. That's when I saw something on the side of the road, just at the edge of my headlights. A figure, standing completely still. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A tall, thin figure, wearing what looked like a long coat or cloak, just standing there on the shoulder of the road, facing the trees. Instinctively, I slowed down, trying to get a better look. But as soon as I did, the figure turned its head slightly, and I swear, even from a distance, I felt its eyes lock onto me. A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the way it moved slow, deliberate, sent a wave of unease through me. I pressed down on the accelerator, not wanting to linger. As I sped past, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The figure was still there, standing motionless, but now it was turned fully toward the road, watching me as I drove away. My heart was pounding, and I forced myself to focus on the road. It was probably just a hitchhiker, I told myself. Someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, I knew something was off. There was no car, no sign of anyone else around. Just that solitary figure in the dark. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see the figure again, somehow following me. The unsettling feeling lingered, like something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I shook it off and tried to concentrate on getting through the rest of the drive. But about 15 minutes later, I saw something ahead, in the distance, just at the edge of my headlights. Another figure, standing by the side of the road. My stomach dropped. It looked exactly like the first one, tall, thin, draped in a long coat, and facing the trees. I slowed down again, though every instinct screamed at me to keep going. As I approached, the figure turned its head, just like the first one had, and I felt that same intense gaze. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I sped up, racing past the figure without looking back. I didn't dare check the mirror this time. My pulse was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat on the back of my neck. What were the chances? Two identical figures, both standing alone on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some sort of roadside art installation, or maybe I was just exhausted and seeing things. But the gnawing unease wouldn't go away. Another 20 minutes passed, and the road seemed even darker and more desolate. That's when I saw the third figure. It was ahead of me again, standing in the same position, with the same eerie stillness. I didn't slow down this time. I pressed the gas pedal hard, racing past it without looking to either side. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the lights of the next town in the distance. Relief washed over me as I left the lonely highway behind and pulled into the first gas station I saw. I parked under the bright lights and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those figures standing in the lot. But there was nothing, just the gas station, quiet and empty. I don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I never will. But ever since then, I've avoided driving those isolated roads late at night. Some things are better left unexplained, and whatever was standing on that road, I hope I never encounter it again. A few months ago, I had to make an unexpected night drive back home from a weekend getaway. My friends had stayed behind, and I needed to get back for work the next day. The drive was long, about 4 hours through winding country roads and dense forests. The trip started out uneventful, but things quickly took a turn for the eerie. The route I chose was less traveled, partly because it was the quickest way home and partly because I enjoyed the solitude. The night was clear, with a bright moon casting eerie shadows over the landscape. As I drove, I cranked up the radio to keep myself alert and focused. Around 2 hours into the drive, I noticed something strange. The road was unusually quiet, no other cars, no wildlife sounds. It was just the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the remote location. Then, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a hitchhiker or someone in distress. I slowed down and approached cautiously, but as I got closer, the figure remained stationary, just standing there in the shadows. It was dressed in what looked like a dark coat, and its face was obscured by the low light. I slowed to a stop, my heart racing. "Are you okay?" I called out, but there was no response. The figure remained motionless, almost as if it were made of stone. I wasn't sure what to do, but I decided not to take any chances. I backed up slowly and continued on my way. As I drove further, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, and the darkness pressed in around me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I tried to focus on the road. After another hour, I saw the figure again. This time, it was further down the road, standing in the middle of the lane. My pulse quickened as I slowed to a stop. The figure was now closer and appeared to be moving toward me, but still at an unnervingly slow pace. I reached for my phone to call for help, but my signal was spotty in this remote area. I decided to turn around and find an alternate route, hoping that whatever I had seen was just a figment of my imagination or a trick of the light. As I reversed, I noticed a pair of headlights approaching from behind. I felt a brief moment of relief, thinking that another driver might help, but the headlights stopped abruptly. The car remained stationary, and the lights went out. Feeling more uneasy than ever, I quickly turned around and drove off down the road. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, but I saw no sign of the figure or the other car. The rest of the drive was a blur of tension and fear. I kept the radio volume up and occasionally glanced at the dark woods flanking the road. When I finally reached the highway and the familiar comfort of streetlights, I felt a wave of relief. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and I arrived home safely. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen and whether it was a real threat or just an illusion created by the isolation and fatigue. The next day, I mentioned the incident to some friends and did a bit of research about the area. To my surprise, I found out that the road I had driven on had a reputation for strange occurrences and ghost stories. Several locals mentioned eerie figures and unexplained phenomena, but nothing concrete had ever been reported. While the experience left me shaken, I'm grateful that nothing more sinister happened. The figure by the road remains a mystery, a shadowy reminder of how quickly the ordinary can become unsettling. Despite the fear and anxiety of that night, I made it home safely and learned to appreciate the bright lights and company of the more populated routes. A few years ago, I was driving home from a late shift at work, taking my usual route through a remote stretch of highway. It was well past midnight, and the road was eerily empty. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional whoosh of wind against my windows. I had always found this particular stretch of highway unsettling, even in the daylight. It's surrounded by dense woods, and there's hardly any cell service out there. That night, however, the road felt different, darker, more oppressive. I attributed it to my fatigue and tried to push the feeling aside. As I drove, I noticed something odd, a series of flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I initially thought it was another vehicle approaching, but the lights didn't seem to get closer. Instead, they flickered erratically, almost like a strobe. I glanced back and saw nothing but darkness, so I focused on the road ahead. The flashing lights continued, and my unease grew. I sped up, hoping to distance myself from whatever was causing the lights, but they persisted, keeping pace with my car. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection, or perhaps my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. Yet, the lights were unmistakably there. After about 10 minutes of this, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. It was too far to make out clearly, but it seemed to be a person or something that resembled one. The figure was motionless, facing the highway, and the lights seemed to originate from this spot. I approached slowly, my anxiety mounting. The figure remained still, illuminated by my headlights. As I got closer, it became apparent that the figure was not a person but a wooden scarecrow, dressed in tattered clothes and holding a lantern. The flickering lights were coming from the lantern, which seemed to sway slightly despite the lack of wind. I drove past the scarecrow, feeling a wave of relief. My nerves were still on edge, but I reassured myself that it was just a scarecrow, an odd but harmless roadside attraction. As I glanced in my rearview mirror, the scarecrow was gone, and the lights had vanished. Just as I was starting to calm down, I saw a series of shadowy figures on the roadside, closer this time, emerging from the edge of the woods. They appeared to be moving, though the darkness made it hard to discern any details. I was gripped by fear, convinced that something supernatural or sinister was happening. I sped up, my heart pounding as the figures seemed to follow the car. The feeling of being pursued was overwhelming, and I drove faster, desperate to escape the growing terror. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I barely registered the passing landscape as I focused on the road ahead. The figures in the woods disappeared as I approached a more populated area. The lights of a gas station in the distance were a welcome sight. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I got out of the car and took a few deep breaths. I looked back at the highway, but everything seemed normal again. I refueled and collected myself, deciding to call my friend to pass the time and calm my nerves. When I recounted the events, they were skeptical but supportive. We laughed it off as an overactive imagination and fatigue. The rest of the drive home was uneventful. I kept my eyes on the road and tried not to think about the scarecrow or the shadowy figures. I made it home safely, but the experience left me deeply unsettled. The next day, I mentioned the scarecrow to a few locals in a nearby town. They assured me that it was just an old prank from a local farmer who liked to set up scarecrows with lanterns for fun. The shadowy figures, they said, were likely just the result of my fear and fatigue. Despite the explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread I had experienced that night. Sometimes, the scariest things are not what we see but what our minds create. The memory of that drive remains vivid, a reminder of how the darkness of the night can play tricks on even the most rational minds. A few years ago, I had to drive home from a late-night event in a small town about 2 hours away. I was alone and had been on the road for nearly an hour, driving through winding country roads surrounded by dense forests. The moon was high, and the headlights cut through the darkness, revealing little more than the narrow road ahead. The drive had started off uneventfully. I was listening to music and enjoying the solitude when I noticed something strange. A pair of headlights appeared behind me, moving at a speed that suggested they were tailgating. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was another driver eager to pass. However, as the minutes ticked by, the car remained close behind me, its headlights glaring through my rearview mirror. I could feel a growing sense of discomfort. The road was isolated, with no other cars in sight, and the persistent presence of the vehicle behind me was unnerving. I tried to shake off the feeling, rationalizing it as a coincidence. After a while, the car's high beams started to flash intermittently, and I noticed that it would occasionally switch to its low beams, only to switch back to high beams moments later. I felt a pang of anxiety. I decided to pull over at a rest area to let the car pass, hoping that this would resolve the unsettling situation. I turned into the rest area and parked under a flickering street light. The car behind me did the same, pulling into a space a few spots away. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the car's headlights turn off, leaving the area bathed in darkness. I sat in my car, feeling an odd mix of relief and apprehension. A few minutes later, I saw the car's headlights flicker back on, but the vehicle remained stationary. I decided to get out of my car to stretch my legs and see if the other driver was also taking a break. As I stepped out, I noticed the other car's engine had been turned off, and it remained eerily still. My instincts told me to be cautious, so I didn't approach the car. Instead, I walked around the rest area, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I could see the other car's interior light was on, casting a faint glow. I tried to convince myself that the driver might be just as unsettled as I was. After about 10 minutes, I decided it was time to head back on the road. I got back into my car and started the engine. As I was about to pull out, I noticed the other car's headlights turn back on. The vehicle began to follow me again, maintaining the same close distance. The sense of dread intensified as I continued driving. The car's headlights seemed to loom larger in my rearview mirror, and the high beams flashed periodically. I drove faster, hoping to outdistance the vehicle, but it stayed right behind me. The road twisted and turned, and the forest seemed to press in on both sides. After about 20 minutes, the car suddenly accelerated and swerved around me, speeding ahead. I was momentarily relieved but couldn't shake the unsettling feeling. I watched as the car's taillights disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone on the empty road. The remainder of the drive was quiet. My heart rate gradually slowed as I approached more populated areas. When I finally reached home, I was exhausted and on edge. I couldn't explain the behavior of the other driver or why they had followed me so persistently. The incident was a chilling reminder of how quickly a routine drive can turn into something eerie. I never learned who that driver was or what their intentions were, but the experience left a lasting impression. I've driven through those same roads since then, but the memory of that unsettling night always lingers. Sometimes, the unknown on a dark road is the scariest thing of all. A few years ago, I took a late-night drive through the countryside with my friend Jake. We were heading back from a music festival in a remote part of the state, and the roads were eerily quiet. We decided to take a scenic route home, hoping to enjoy the peaceful night drive and the starry sky. The highway we were on wound through a dense forest, with tall trees arching overhead and the road curving around hidden bends. The only light came from the headlights of my car, cutting through the darkness. We were chatting about the festival and listening to music, the occasional crackle of the radio punctuating our conversation. Around midnight, we reached a particularly isolated stretch of road. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the darkness felt more oppressive. I had driven this route before, but tonight it felt different, almost as if something was lurking in the shadows. I brushed off the feeling and kept driving. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. The figure was barely visible in the headlights but seemed to be a person standing motionless in the middle of the road. I skidded to a stop a few feet away, my breath coming in quick bursts. Jake and I stared at the figure, trying to make out more details. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, and his posture was unnervingly still. I honked the horn, hoping to scare him away, but he didn't move. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he just stood there, unmoving and silent. After a few tense moments, the man slowly turned his head toward us. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes glinted eerily in the headlights. A chill ran down my spine, and I could see that Jake was equally frightened. We considered calling the police, but in this remote area, it could take a while for them to arrive. I decided to slowly drive past the figure, keeping a close eye on him. As we moved forward, he stepped aside just enough to let us pass. My pulse quickened as we drove by, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing in the road, watching us as we drove away. The rest of the drive was tense. We both felt a strong sense of dread and kept glancing over our shoulders, expecting to see the man following us. The forest seemed to press in on us, and every rustle of leaves felt like it could be a sign of someone or something lurking just beyond the edge of the road. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached a gas station that was open 24 hours. We stopped to get out of the car and stretch our legs, still shaken by the encounter. We talked to the attendant, who seemed unfazed by our story. He mentioned that people occasionally reported strange encounters in that area but said it was probably just a person in need of help. Though the encounter was deeply unsettling, we were relieved to be in a more populated area. We continued our drive home without incident, though the strange figure remained a topic of conversation for the rest of the trip. When we finally made it back, we shared our experience with friends and family. Some were skeptical, while others were intrigued. We later learned that the area where we saw the figure was known for its eerie stories and legends, but nothing definitive ever came to light. The encounter remains a chilling memory, a reminder of how quickly a serene night drive can turn into something unsettling. We were lucky that nothing more came of it and that we made it home safely. Sometimes, the most frightening experiences are the ones that leave you with more questions than answers, and the dark roads of the countryside still carry an air of mystery for me to this day. A few years ago, I took a late-night drive home from a work event in a small town several hours away. The drive was long but uneventful until I reached a stretch of highway known for its desolation and dense woods on either side. It was a crisp autumn night, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows through the trees. I was about halfway through this lonely stretch when I noticed something unusual in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights had appeared far behind me, moving steadily closer. I wasn't too concerned at first, there are always late-night travelers on such roads. But as the car approached, it stayed unnervingly close to my rear bumper. Despite my attempts to increase my speed, I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to focus on the road while keeping an eye on the headlights. They were bright and glaring, making it difficult to see anything else behind me. The car seemed to be right on my tail, and the constant glare was making me anxious. After about 15 minutes of this unsettling tailgating, I decided to pull over at a rest stop that appeared ahead. I figured that if the driver was just impatient, they'd pass me, and I could continue my journey in peace. I pulled into the dimly lit rest area and parked, hoping the other vehicle would move on. To my surprise, the car also pulled into the rest area and parked directly behind me. The headlights remained on, and the vehicle remained stationary, casting an ominous glow over the empty parking lot. I sat in my car, and sure of what to do, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The other vehicle was a dark, nondescript sedan, and its headlights seemed to burn even more intensely. I decided to call the police, feeling increasingly uneasy. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that they would send someone to check on the rest area. As I waited, I saw a shadowy figure emerge from the sedan. The figure was tall and dressed in dark clothing, but the dim light made it hard to see details. My heart raced as the figure approached my car. I locked the doors and kept my phone ready. The person walked past my car, moving toward the rest area's small building, and I saw them disappear inside. The car's headlights were still on, and the vehicle remained in the same spot. Moments later, the police arrived. The officer approached my car and asked for details. I explained the situation, and he went to check the rest area. After a few minutes, he returned and informed me that the rest area was empty, and the figure had left the building. The officer checked the dark sedan and confirmed it was unoccupied. There was no sign of any disturbance or danger. Feeling somewhat relieved but still shaken, I thanked the officer and decided to continue my drive. The rest of the journey was uneventful, and I finally arrived home safe and sound. I never found out who the person in the dark sedan was or why they had followed me so closely. The whole experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. I learned to be cautious on lonely stretches of road and always be aware of my surroundings, especially during late-night drives. Though nothing bad happened and everyone was safe, the incident remains a haunting memory. Sometimes, the most mundane activities can turn into unsettling experiences, reminding us that even in seemingly safe places, we must remain vigilant.